Welcome back to Spooky Stories, Unexplained Encounters. Today, we'll be covering one of my favorite cases, the Pascagoula abduction. What exactly did two Mississippians encounter that evening in 1973 on what should have been a peaceful fishing excursion? Who, or what, made contact? The sun is setting in Pascagoula, Mississippi when Charles Hickson, 42, and Calvin Parker, 19, drove out to a pier on the bank of the Pascagoula River. The two men were celebrating Parker's new job at a shipyard, a position that Hickson had helped the younger man acquire. They were using Hickson's equipment, as Parker was new to the area and did not yet have his own just yet. Of this seemingly simple gesture, Parker is quoted in Country Road magazine as saying, "Now, for a man that loves to fish from the South to offer you to use his fishing equipment, that's like him offering you his wife. Just unheard of." Excited to fish and enjoy the evening, the two first made their way to one of the fishing locations before being driven off by a swarm of bugs. After, they decided to fish at the shipyard where Hickson apparently fished often. Parker was nervous about this at first, as there was a sign warning them to keep out. After overcoming the initial worry, the two got settled in, cast, and waited for the fish to bite. What follows is Parker's account of what happened to him the night of October 11th, 1973. To hear more about Parker's account, please visit Country Roads magazine, linked below, where much of this research was sourced from. Parker is quoted as saying, "I distinctly remember, I was looking at a boat across. It was an old oar boat that they do the weather with, and it was made out of steel. And I was thinking to myself, now, how does something made out of steel float? That's where my mind was, and that's when I noticed the blue, hazy lights coming in from behind. You could see the reflection across the water." As they were in an area they were not supposed to be, Parker's immediate thought was that the lights were from the police. The men stood up to move away from the area when they stopped in their tracks. Coming towards them was not a police car, but instead a long, ovular craft. The vehicle floated a few feet off the ground. The light became brighter and brighter, blinding them. But Parker noticed that there wasn't just a craft coming towards them. Standing out from the light were three large creatures. "I still didn't know what they were. That was coming towards us," Parker is quoted as saying. "By the time they got to us, I still couldn't see, for the light was so bright." Parker then says that the creatures injected him with some sort of fluid that quickly soothed his anxiety. After the shot, Parker said he didn't care what happened then. Parker remembers being brought into the craft, going down a hallway before eventually being placed on a table. The creature that had carried him in left after he lay down in the cooled glass. Staring upwards, he noticed that something was opening up in the ceiling. He watched, still in a daze, as a small square object came down from above. Unfazed, Parker's eyes followed the device as it looped around him, making clicking sounds, almost like it was scanning him. After completing whatever its task had been, the object shot back up into the ceiling, leaving Parker alone in the room. But it wasn't long before he had another visitor. The door opened and a woman walked into the room. She was normal, not like the robot-like creatures that had brought him onto the ship. She was human? Or perhaps not quite. Parker noticed that while most of her appeared as a normal human woman, her middle fingers were much longer than average. He wasn't able to lift his head from the table to view her closely, but she did start to make her way over to him. Upon reaching him, she grabbed his head and pushed his mouth open, sticking her long middle finger down into his throat. Parker is quoted as saying that this rough attack scratched his throat, making him bleed and gag. When it pulled its long finger out, it began to make a gurgling sound, described by Parker as an alligator's mating call. Hurt and still under the influence of the injection, Parker watched as the creature that had initially brought him into the craft returned, picked him up, and carried him out of the ship and back to the water's edge. According to Parker, that's where the story really starts. And then my life turned pretty much to hell right after that. But what of Hickson? What did he experience that night? According to an interview Hickson gave to CTV News in 1975, he's quoted as saying, We were sitting on the side of the pier with our feet towards the other side of the river. I told Calvin we might as well go home. I heard a zipping sound, turned around, and saw some kind of craft. It came down and hovered about 2 feet off the ground. We didn't know what to do. The river behind us, and that out there, not knowing what that was. Then before we had time to really do anything, it seemed like an opening appeared, and towards the end it was up to us, and, it had blue flashing lights. When the opening appeared, some sort of light came from the inside. He thought it was people coming towards him at first. He was quoted as saying, "It was the most shock I ever had in my life." The creatures coming out of the craft were described by Hickson as, well, they were shorter than me. I'd say about 5'2" or 3. They didn't have a neck, and their head seemed to come directly to their shoulders. He described them as having a point where a person's nose would be and long pointed ears. They had arms and hands that were weld and a thumb. 2 creatures approached him and grabbed him by the arms, lifting him up off the ground to their height and brought him into the craft. Entering the ship, Hickson reportedly did not see any tables or chairs, and the light was almost blinding. They leaned him back, and something, described by Hickson as an eye, came up to him. It hovered there for a few seconds and started moving over his entire body. He then describes being removed from the craft by the same strange creatures and being set back onto the ground. Hickson looked over and then saw Parker, standing facing the river with his arms outstretched in front of him, like he was staring at something. The 2 men returned to their car after their respective experiences, but when they came up to the vehicle, they found the passenger door window was shattered in the frame. When trying to start it, it failed to start several times, which Parker claimed was unusual. The 2 men began to drive back home. On the ride, they initially decided not to tell anyone of the encounter. Yet, as they neared town, Hickson changed his mind and dialed Kessler Air Force Base and explained to them what had happened to them that night. The response? Project Blue Book was over, and they no longer handled UFO reports. The men needed to call the local authorities. And that is exactly what they did. The 2 made their way to Jackson County Sheriff's Department, where they were brought in for separate questioning. After their initial reports, they were left together in a room with a tape recorder set up to secretly record them. The recordings have since resurfaced and can be listened to in full in the link in the description. On the tapes, the 2 men talk about their encounter. When we listened, we thought they sounded upset, and as if they were in a state of disbelief. They go back and forth. Hickson mentions that he doesn't think this is going to be the only thing that happens. It's going to happen again. Parker discusses how he passed out. It sounds like 2 men trying to make sense of what had just happened to them. In the same interview from 1975, the sheriff is asked by the interviewer if he could share what happened last night. He's quoted as saying, "No, sir, I can't. All I can tell you, there was 2 men that came in the sheriff's department approximately 8:30 and 9 o'clock. They're all excited and upset, wanted to climb the walls, hysterical, crying. That's actually all I know is what happened. As far as me seeing what happened, I don't know." The sheriff retells how they interviewed the men individually that night and then left them alone together for the recording. He went on to say that one of the men appeared to be praying, saying, "After all I went through on this earth, I said, why should I have to see something like this?" The sheriff did not only record the men, but he also had them take lie detectors. According to authorities, the team that administers the test runs the test 6 times a day, and when they were asked to come over here to talk to these people, they had in their minds that it was just a big joke. And if I understand it correctly, they ran one test on Mr. Hickson, the machine showed that he was telling the truth, then they run another one, and then the examiner began to wonder himself, so he ran the 3rd test and he believed just what Mr. Hickson had told him. According to a Washington Post article from 2019, both men were administered and passed polygraph tests. Of the interviews, "We did everything we knew to try to break their stories," the county sheriff's captain told the Post in 1975. "If they were lying to me, they should be in Hollywood." As with many UFO sightings and supposed alien abductions, the story exploded almost overnight, and soon the town was flooded with those who wished to have an encounter themselves. Local homeowners reportedly put aluminum foil in their windows. Hickson went on to talk about his experience on Johnny Carson and Dick Cavett. Later on, he wrote a book. Parker, on the other hand, shied away from the spotlight. He told those who tried to interview him that he had passed out and did not remember the encounter. He then left town, got married, worked, and tried to live a quiet life away from the story. Which he did, for the most part, until he finally shared his story almost 30 years after the fact. Parker and Hickson are reportedly not the only ones to have seen something strange in the sky that night in Pascagoula. In the interview from 1975, a man named Mr. Booth is interviewed by reporters. When asked about what happened that night, he says, "I got up and turned off the TV and came to the front door, just as usual, checking to see if it were locked. He looked out the front window and saw some bright light coming from outside. I opened the door and stepped out to see if I could see what it really was." He describes it as, "It was a disc-like shape with a dome on top, with lights around the edges, with many lights. It was spinning counterclockwise. As the man watched, the object sped off into the night sky." In March of 2019, the city was preparing to install a commemorative mark in the spot where Hickson and Parker encountered the strange beings. During that time, new witnesses came forward, ready to share what they experienced that night. One couple, the Blairs, claimed that they were in their car at Graham's Seafood on the opposite side of the river that night, waiting for a captain to take them offshore. They waited in their car for several hours for the captain to appear. It began to get late, and the sky darkened. It was near dusk when Mrs. Blair looked out and spied something peculiar. She is quoted in the Clarion Ledger as saying, "I was looking at the sky and I noticed a blue light in the sky over where they were fishing. It started moving and it seemed like it was following along the Pascagoula River. I just seen the lights on. It was just going back and forth. Sometimes it would just sit there. It went on for 20 to 25 minutes. Mr. Blair is quoted as saying, "I thought it was a helicopter initially and just blew it off. It landed about 150 to 200 yards from us. It was just north of the bridge. I was there, but stupid me didn't pay much attention to it. I was just going offshore and thinking about other things." Mrs. Blair then claimed to have seen something that looked like a person down in the river. Mr. Blair did not see it, suggesting instead that it had been a dolphin. After hearing Parker's story, Mrs. Blair is quoted as saying, "I thought it was a person, but now I think it was an alien." What Parker described was exactly it. That same evening, a Miss Branning was sitting with her roommate and their dates in a car at a traffic light. Branning reports that as she and the group were waiting for the light to turn, she noticed lights in the sky. She is quoted as saying, "I saw some lights and I wasn't sure what I was looking at because it was so far away." As with many witnesses, Branning first believed she was seeing an airplane, but as the object came closer, she realized that it was something else entirely. It didn't make noise. It had bright, bright lights. It got closer and it was hovering. It's kind of a saucer shape or dish shape with a rounded top. The radio started sounding like it was running through all of the stations and the car went dead. We were freaking out. The four agreed not to say anything about the sighting. Branning said she told a few people, but not many, as she was concerned about what they would think of her, which, given the time and situation, is entirely understandable. 49 years after the encounter, there are still questions around what happened that night in Pascagoula. Skeptics suggest it was a hoax. Aviation journalist Philip Klass said he found discrepancies in Hickson's tale and wrote about it in his book, UFOs Explained. He said that Hickson had originally described the creatures as having a hole for a mouth, but later referred to it as a slit. Skeptical investigator Joe Nickel considered Hickson's activities questionable and suggested that he altered his story over time. He also called out that no one on the busy bridge nearby reported seeing any sort of UFO. It was thought that perhaps Hickson dreamt up to his encounter during a hypnagogic dream state. Hypnagogia is the transition from being awake to falling asleep. Lucid dreaming, hallucinations, and sleep paralysis can all happen during this fascinating time. But what of Parker? How could two men have such similar stories but not have seen the same thing? What is interesting is the original story Parker told reporters, that he was passed out when the encounter happened and couldn't remember anything. Interestingly, this is also echoed on the original recordings from 1973. Parker can be heard saying that he passed out. However, in 2018, Parker told the Sun Herald that this was a lie, and that he did in fact remember the encounter as it is described above. Nickel suggested that this could be an example of folie à deux, or folly of two, in which one person acquiesces to the beliefs or ideas of another for some reason. Hickson continued to share his story of an alien abduction until his death in 2011. In more recent years, Parker came forward and shared his story of what he saw and published a book, Pascagoula, The Close Encounter. Unless new information comes out or additional evidence, we may never know what exactly happened that night at the river's edge in Pascagoula. Hickson believed that there was more to the incident than even they understood. He is quoted as saying, "I think there has to be a reason why Calvin and I were picked. I think they know more about what is going on down on this earth than we think. They might be looking for someone that could hold up under the strain and convince people that there is another world and there's some kind of life on it. To that end, convincing humankind that there are other worlds and that there's life out there, well, we're unsure if that has been fulfilled. If nothing else, the encounter has given many generations something to at least dream of, a world beyond our own. Thank you for listening to tonight's story. Tune back in next week as we dive into the world of cryptids, extraterrestrials, and the great unknown. Good night.